Professor Richard Hayes had been teaching at Lincoln State University for almost 20 years. He wasn't the kind of teacher students forgot about after graduation. Some loved him, some were terrified of him, but everyone remembered him. He had this way of making you think differently about everything you thought you knew. His classes weren't easy, but they changed people. It was a typical Monday morning in late October, the kind where the air feels crisp and the leaves crunch under your feet as you walk across campus. Students were shuffling into the large lecture hall, coffees in hand, backpacks slung over shoulders. Most of them looked tired. It was that point in the semester where the initial excitement had worn off, and the reality of midterms was setting in. The room could hold about 150 students, and it was almost full that day. These weren't freshmen taking some required course they didn't care about. These were juniors and seniors who had specifically chosen to take advanced critical thinking. They knew what they were signing up for, or at least they thought they did. Professor Hayes was already in the room when most students arrived. He stood at the front near his desk, arms crossed, watching everyone file in. He was in his early 50s with graying hair and glasses that he had a habit of pushing up his nose when he was about to make a point. He wore his usual outfit of slacks and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up. There was something about his presence that made the room feel serious, even before class started. Students took their usual seats. Some chatted quietly with friends. Others were scrolling through their phones, trying to squeeze in a few more minutes of distraction before class began. A few were reviewing their notes from the previous week, though they weren't sure why. Professor Hayes hadn't mentioned anything about a test or quiz. That's when people started to notice something odd. On each desk, there was a single sheet of paper placed face down. That wasn't normal. Professor Hayes usually handed out materials during class, not before. Students exchanged curious glances. Some whispered to their neighbors, asking if they knew what was going on. When the clock hit 9, Professor Hayes walked to the center of the room. The conversations died down. He didn't say good morning. He didn't make small talk. He just stood there for a moment, looking at all of them with an expression that was hard to read. Was he amused, serious? It was impossible to tell. Then he spoke. His voice was calm but commanding. Good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a good weekend. Today, we're going to do something a little different. He paused, letting those words sink in. You'll notice there's a paper on your desk. That's your midterm exam. The room went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Students sat up straighter in their seats. A few people's eyes went wide. The midterm now? Without any warning? You have exactly 1 hour, Professor Hayes continued, checking his watch. This exam will count for 40% of your final grade. The instructions are on the paper in front of you. You may not use your phones, your notes, or any other materials. This is a closed-book exam. He walked back to his desk and sat down. You may begin. For a moment, nobody moved. Everyone was still processing what had just happened. Then slowly, hands reached for the papers on their desks. The sound of rustling filled the room as students flipped them over, and then the shock set in. The page was almost completely blank. At the very top, it said, Midterm Exam, Advanced Critical Thinking, October 23rd. Below that, centered in the middle of the page, was a single word in bold letters. Why? That was it. Nothing else. No instructions. No context. No hint about what the question was even asking. Just one word sitting there on an otherwise empty page, staring back at them. Students looked at their papers, then at each other, then back at their papers. Some people's mouths literally fell open. Others furrowed their brows in confusion. A few nervous laughs escaped from different corners of the room, the kind of laugh you make when you're not sure if something is a joke or not. One brave student in the third row raised his hand. Professor Hayes? His voice cracked a little. Is there another page? Or maybe the printing got messed up. Professor Hayes didn't even look up from whatever he was reading at his desk. Everything you need is on that page, he said simply. Another student tried. But what are we supposed to answer? What's the question? You have 57 minutes remaining, was all Professor Hayes said. That's when the panic really started to set in. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a printing error. This was the actual exam. Students stared at the single word, trying to make sense of it. Why what? Why anything? Why everything? What could he possibly want them to write? Some students started writing immediately, their pens moving frantically across the page. They figured something was better than nothing. If they just started writing, maybe they'd figure it out along the way. Better to have an answer than no answer at all, right? One girl near the front started writing about why philosophy matters. She filled up lines talking about how asking questions is important for society, how we need to understand ourselves and the world around us. She wrote quickly, barely pausing to think, just trying to fill the page with something that sounded intelligent. A guy in the back corner began writing about why humans exist. He dove into theories about consciousness and purpose, about evolution and meaning. His handwriting got messier as he rushed to get his thoughts down before time ran out. Another student took a different approach. She wrote about why we ask why in the first place. What makes humans curious? Why do we need reasons for things? She thought maybe that's what Professor Hayes wanted, something meta, something that questioned the question itself. But not everyone started writing. Some students just sat there frozen. They couldn't even begin to figure out where to start. How do you answer a question that isn't really a question? How do you write an essay about a single word with no context? The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Each second felt like it lasted forever. Students who were writing kept glancing at others' papers, trying to see if anyone else had figured something out. Students who weren't writing felt their anxiety growing with each passing minute. The pressure was crushing. About 15 minutes in, you could divide the room into 3 groups. There were the writers, still frantically filling pages with whatever came to mind. There were the frozen ones staring at their blank papers with growing desperation. And then there was one student sitting quietly in the back corner by the window. His name was David Chen. He wasn't one of the most vocal students in class. He didn't always raise his hand or participate in every discussion. But when he did speak, people listened. He had this way of seeing things from angles nobody else considered. He was the kind of person who stayed quiet because he was actually thinking, not because he didn't have anything to say. David hadn't written a single word. His pen sat on his desk, untouched. He just stared at the paper in front of him. But unlike the other students who were frozen in panic, David looked calm. His expression was thoughtful, concentrated. He was working on something, even if his pen wasn't moving. Around him, the chaos continued. Someone dropped their pen and it clattered loudly on the floor. Another student sighed so heavily it sounded like they were giving up. The girl in front of David was on her 4th page, writing smaller and smaller to fit more words. Professor Hayes remained at his desk, seemingly unbothered by the stress he'd created. He occasionally looked up at the class, his expression neutral, then went back to whatever papers he was grading. If he felt any sympathy for his struggling students, he didn't show it. 30 minutes passed, then 40. The students who had been writing were starting to slow down. How much can you really say about why without any context? Some were reading back through what they'd written, realizing it probably didn't make sense. Others were trying to add more, padding their answers with whatever philosophical concepts they could remember from previous classes. The students who had been frozen were now in full panic mode. Some had finally started writing something, anything, just to have words on the page. Others had given up entirely, slumped in their seats, waiting for this nightmare to end. David was still just sitting there, staring at his paper. But now there was the slightest hint of a smile on his face. Not a big smile, not confident or cocky. Just a small upturn at the corners of his mouth, like something had just clicked in his mind. With 15 minutes left on the clock, the energy in the room had completely shifted. The frantic writing had mostly stopped. Now it was just quiet dread. Students were convinced they'd failed. Some were already thinking about how this would affect their final grade, whether they could still pass the class. Others were angry, feeling like this was unfair, impossible, designed to make them fail. But David finally picked up his pen. The lecture hall had never felt so tense. You know that feeling when you're taking a test and you realize you have no idea what you're doing? That sick feeling in your stomach that just gets worse as time goes on? That's what filled the room. It was like the air itself was heavy with stress and confusion. Jessica Turner was sitting in the 2nd row, and she was already on her 3rd page. She'd always been a good student, the type who prepared for everything, who studied hard and followed the rules. But right now, none of that mattered. She had no idea if what she was writing made any sense at all. Her hand hurt from writing so fast, and she kept having to shake it out before continuing. She'd started by writing about why philosophy is important to study. Then she'd moved on to why humans need meaning in their lives. Now she was writing about why we make the choices we do. Each paragraph felt weaker than the last. She could feel herself grasping at straws, just throwing out ideas and hoping something would stick. Every few sentences, she'd stop and read back what she wrote, and each time she felt less confident. The worst part was that she could see other people writing too, and their pens were moving just as fast as hers. What if they'd figured something out that she hadn't? What if there was an obvious answer she was completely missing? Her anxiety was feeding on itself, growing bigger with each passing minute. Next to her sat Brian Patterson. He'd taken a completely different approach. After staring at the paper for 10 minutes, he'd decided to write about existence itself. Why do we exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? He was pulling from everything he could remember from his introduction to philosophy class last year. Descartes, Sartre, Nietzsche, anyone who'd ever asked big questions about life. His essay was turning into this long, winding exploration of existential philosophy. He wrote about consciousness and free will. He wrote about determinism and chaos theory. He even threw in some stuff about quantum mechanics that he'd seen in a documentary once. He wasn't sure if any of it actually answered the question, but at least he was writing something. At least he was trying. But deep down, Brian had this nagging feeling that he was way off track. It was like trying to hit a target in the dark. You can swing as hard as you want, but if you can't see what you're aiming at, you're probably going to miss. A few rows back, Melissa Rodriguez had gone in yet another direction. She decided that maybe the question was about why we ask questions in the first place. So she was writing about human curiosity, about how asking why is what separates us from other animals. She wrote about children constantly asking why, about how that curiosity is what drives science and discovery. Her answer was actually pretty thoughtful. She talked about how why is the most fundamental question humans ask. It's how we learn, how we grow, how we make sense of the world. She felt somewhat confident about her approach, more confident than most people in the room. But there was still that doubt. That little voice asking, but is this what he wanted? Across the aisle, Kevin Walsh had completely given up. He'd tried to start writing 3 different times, and each time he'd erased everything after a few sentences. Nothing felt right. The question was just too vague, too open-ended. How could anyone possibly know what answer Professor Hayes was looking for? It felt less like a test and more like a cruel joke. Kevin glanced up at the clock. 35 minutes left. He looked down at his nearly blank paper. He looked over at the guy next to him, who had covered almost 2 full pages in tiny handwriting. Kevin felt his chest tighten. He was going to fail. There was no way around it. 40% of his grade gone, just like that. He wasn't the only one feeling hopeless. Around the room, you could see it on people's faces. Some students had their heads in their hands. Others were staring blankly at the ceiling, like maybe the answer was written up there somewhere. A few were still writing, but you could tell they were just going through the motions now, no longer believing that what they were writing mattered. The sound of pens scratching on paper had slowed down considerably. In the first 15 minutes, it had been almost constant, this frantic scribbling as everyone rushed to get something down. But now the room was quieter. More thoughtful maybe, but also more defeated. Professor Hayes sat at his desk, completely calm. Every so often he'd look up and scan the room, his face giving away nothing. He'd take a sip from his coffee mug. He'd flip a page in whatever he was reading. He seemed totally unbothered by the fact that his students were having collective breakdowns all around him. Some students found his calmness infuriating. How could he just sit there while they suffered? Did he enjoy watching them struggle? Others found it oddly reassuring. If Professor Hayes wasn't worried, maybe there was hope. Maybe they were all overthinking it. Maybe it would all make sense in the end. But for most people, his calm presence just made everything more confusing. It was like he knew something they didn't. Like this was all part of some grand plan that would eventually become clear. But right now, in this moment, it just felt cruel. Meanwhile, David Chen was still sitting quietly in his corner seat. He still hadn't written anything. His exam paper had nothing on it except the printed question. His pen remained on the desk unused. But he wasn't frozen like Kevin or the others who'd given up. He was actively thinking, working through something in his mind. David had a different way of approaching problems. While everyone else had immediately asked themselves, what should I write about why? David had asked a different question. He'd asked, what is Professor Hayes actually testing us on? This was advanced critical thinking, not a philosophy essay class. Professor Hayes had spent the entire semester teaching them to question assumptions, to look at problems from different angles, to recognize when something that seemed complicated was actually simple, or when something that seemed simple was actually complicated. So David sat there and thought about the test itself. Why would a professor give a one-word exam? What was the purpose? What could possibly be learned from answering such a vague question? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that maybe the question wasn't the point. Maybe it was something else entirely. Around him, his classmates continued their struggle. The guy sitting directly in front of David had just started his 5th page. 5th, he was writing about why society creates rules, why humans form governments, why we need structure and order. It was actually a pretty interesting essay. If this had been a normal assignment, he probably would have gotten a good grade on it. But something told David that writing more wasn't the answer here. Time kept moving forward. 40 minutes had passed. Students were starting to get that look people get near the end of an exam, tired, stressed, ready for it to be over. Some were reading through what they'd written, trying to add finishing touches. Others had already mentally checked out, just waiting for Professor Hayes to tell them time was up. Jessica in the second row had finally stopped writing. She'd filled up 4.5 pages and she couldn't think of anything else to add. She read back through her essay, and with each paragraph her heart sank a little more. It was all over the place. She jumped from topic to topic without any real connection. It was the kind of essay you write when you're desperate, when you're throwing everything at the wall hoping something sticks. She glanced around the room, trying to gauge how others were doing. Some people looked confident. Most looked worried. A few looked completely defeated. She tried to take some comfort in the fact that everyone seemed confused, not just her. At least she wasn't alone in this. Brian had finally finished his essay about existentialism. He'd managed to connect various philosophers and their ideas into something that resembled a coherent argument. He felt okay about it, better than some probably, but he still had this sinking suspicion that he'd completely missed the point. It was like solving the wrong math problem. You can get the right answer to the wrong question, and it still counts as wrong. Melissa was proofreading her work, fixing small grammar mistakes and trying to make her handwriting neater where it had gotten messy. She'd made some good points about human curiosity and the importance of asking questions. She thought maybe she'd at least pass even if she didn't get a great grade. That's all she could hope for at this point. Kevin, who'd given up earlier, had finally forced himself to write something in the last 10 minutes. It was barely half a page, just some basic thoughts about why people do things and why the world is the way it is. It was generic and uninspired, and he knew it. But it was better than handing in a blank page. Barely. All around the room, it was the same story. Students who'd written too much, students who hadn't written enough, students who'd written about completely different things, all hoping they'd somehow stumbled onto the right answer. The beautiful thing about a one-word question with no context is that you can justify almost any answer. The terrible thing about it is that you have no way of knowing if you're right. Professor Hayes checked his watch. 15 minutes remaining, he announced. His voice cut through the tense silence, making several students jump in their seats. 15 minutes. That triggered a new wave of panic for those who'd barely written anything. It brought a sense of relief to those who were finished and just waiting for it to end. And for David, sitting quietly in the back, it meant it was almost time. He looked down at his blank paper. The single word "why" stared back at him. All around him, people had filled pages and pages trying to answer it. They'd pulled from philosophy and science and personal experience. They'd written about existence and meaning and purpose and curiosity. They'd done everything they could think of to give Professor Hayes what he wanted. But David had spent the last 45 minutes thinking about what Professor Hayes actually wanted. And he'd come to a conclusion. The question wasn't asking for an explanation. The question was asking them to think differently, to challenge assumptions, to recognize when the problem itself was the issue. This wasn't about philosophy. It wasn't about writing a brilliant essay. It was about critical thinking in its purest form. It was about recognizing that sometimes the best response to a question isn't an answer. It's another question. David picked up his pen. While his classmates had filled pages, he was about to write just 2 words. 2 simple words that would change everything. But first, he wanted to be absolutely sure. He sat there for another moment, thinking it through one more time, making sure he wasn't about to make a huge mistake. Around him, students were making last-minute edits, adding final thoughts or just sitting in anxious silence. The clock ticked down. 12 minutes, 11, 10. The end was near and everyone could feel it. Some felt relief. Others felt dread. But everyone felt something. And then David started writing. With 10 minutes left on the clock, David Chen finally put his pen to paper. But while his classmates had spent the last 50 minutes filling page after page, David wrote just 2 words. 2 simple words beneath the question, why, on his exam. Then he set his pen down and looked at what he'd written. He sat there for a moment, reading those 2 words over and over. Part of him wondered if he was making a huge mistake. 40% of his grade hung in the balance. This wasn't the kind of test where you could afford to take a wild guess. But the more he looked at his answer, the more certain he became. This felt right. It felt true to everything Professor Hayes had taught them all semester. David had always been different from other students. Not in a showy way. He didn't try to be the smartest person in the room or the most interesting. But he thought about things differently. When everyone else went left, he'd stop and ask why nobody was going right. When a problem seemed impossible, he'd step back and question whether it was actually a problem at all. That's what he'd done for the past 50 minutes. While everyone else tried to solve the puzzle, David questioned whether there was a puzzle to solve in the first place. And that's what led him to his answer. 2 words that challenged the entire premise of the exam. He read them one more time. Then he stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor made several students look up from their papers. David gathered his exam and started walking toward the front of the room. Every eye in the lecture hall followed him. You have to understand how shocking this was. It was only 10 minutes into the exam when David stood up. Most students were still writing frantically or staring at their papers in desperation. Nobody finished early, nobody. Especially not on one of Professor Hayes's exams, and especially not when the exam was supposedly impossible. David walked down the aisle between the seats, his footsteps echoing in the quiet room. The sound seemed impossibly loud. Students watched him with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief, to something like awe. Jessica, still clutching her pen in the second row, watched him pass with wide eyes. Had he figured it out? Or had he given up? Brian turned completely around in his seat to watch David walk by. He glanced down at David's exam paper, trying to see what was written on it. But David held it close to his chest. Kevin, who'd barely written half a page, felt a mix of hope and dread. If David had figured something out, maybe there was a real answer to this impossible test. But that also meant Kevin had definitely gotten it wrong. The whole room seemed to hold its breath as David approached Professor Hayes's desk. The professor looked up, and for the first time all morning, his expression changed. Just slightly, but enough to notice. His eyebrows raised a fraction of an inch. He hadn't expected anyone to finish this early. Especially not to finish with confidence. David placed his exam face down on the desk, exactly as Professor Hayes had instructed them to at the beginning. The paper made a soft sound as it hit the wood. For a brief moment, David and Professor Hayes just looked at each other. No words were exchanged. David gave a small, respectful nod. Professor Hayes nodded back, his expression unreadable again. Then David turned and walked out of the lecture hall. He didn't rush. He didn't look back. He just left, calm and composed, as if he'd just turned in a regular homework assignment and not the exam that was worth 40% of his grade. The door closed behind him with a soft click. The room erupted in whispers. Not loud talking, because Professor Hayes was still there and they were still technically taking an exam. But urgent, hushed conversations broke out everywhere. Students leaned toward each other, eyes wide, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Did he just leave? Someone whispered. What did he write? Do you think he figured it out? Maybe he just gave up? No way. Did you see his face? He looked confident. I should have sat closer. I could have seen his answer. Professor Hayes cleared his throat, and the whispers immediately stopped. You have 8 minutes remaining, he said calmly. I suggest you focus on your own work. He didn't look up from his desk, where David's exam now sat face down, not yet looked at. But how could anyone focus now? David's dramatic exit had thrown everyone off. The students who'd been confident in their answers now felt doubt creeping in. If David had figured out something different, something they'd all missed, then their pages of writing might be completely wrong. The students who'd been struggling now felt even more hopeless. They hadn't figured it out in 50 minutes, and they certainly weren't going to figure it out in the next 8. Jessica stared at her 4.5 pages of writing. Suddenly, all those words seemed pointless. She'd gone on and on about philosophy and meaning and purpose, filling up space because she thought that's what you were supposed to do on an exam. But David had turned in his paper early. Really early. That either meant he was a genius or she was overthinking everything. She couldn't decide which option scared her more. Melissa, who'd felt somewhat confident about her essay on human curiosity, now felt that confidence drain away. She looked at her 3 pages of careful arguments and explanations. It was good work, she thought. But what if good work wasn't what Professor Hayes was looking for? What if this test wasn't about being good? What if it was about being different? Around the room, you could see the same thoughts playing out on different faces. Doubt, confusion, worry. A few students frantically tried to add more to their papers in the remaining minutes, as if more words would somehow make their answers more right. Others just gave up, putting their pens down and accepting whatever fate awaited them. Brian kept thinking about David's face as he'd walked out. That calm expression, that confidence. David wasn't the type to show off or take reckless chances. If he'd turned in his paper early, he must have been sure about his answer. But what could it possibly be? What answer to why? Could be so simple that it fit on 1 page and could be completed in 50 minutes? Kevin almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. Here he was, sitting with his half-page of generic nonsense watching someone else walk out confidently while he had no clue what was happening. This whole exam felt like a cruel experiment. Put a bunch of students in a room, give them an impossible task and watch them squirm. Was that what critical thinking was about? Making people feel stupid? The minutes ticked by. Some students made last-minute changes to their papers. Others sat in silence waiting for it to be over. The energy in the room had completely shifted. Before David's exit, there'd been a kind of collective struggle, everyone suffering together in confusion. But now there was this new layer of uncertainty, the possibility that there was a right answer, and most of them had missed it. Professor Hayes remained at his desk, giving no indication of what he thought of David's early submission. He didn't pick up the exam to look at it. He didn't smile or frown or give any clue about whether David had done well or poorly. He just sat there waiting for time to run out, as calm as he'd been when this whole thing started. "Time's up," he finally announced. "Please put your pens down and bring your exams to the front." There was a collective sigh of relief mixed with dread. It was over. For better or worse, it was done. Students stood up gathering their papers. Some had written so much that their hands were cramping. Others had barely filled a page. Everyone looked exhausted in different ways. They formed a line at Professor Hayes's desk, each person placing their exam face down on top of the growing pile. As they turned in their papers, students tried to catch a glimpse of David's exam underneath, but it was impossible to see what he'd written. Professor Hayes accepted each exam with a neutral, "Thank you," his face revealing nothing. Jessica handed in her paper and felt a weight lift off her shoulders, even though she was pretty sure she'd failed. At least it was done. Brian turned in his existential philosophy essay and immediately started second-guessing every word he'd written. Melissa handed over her pages about curiosity and questioning, still thinking they were decent even if they weren't what Professor Hayes wanted. Kevin handed in his pathetic half-page and tried not to think about what this meant for his grade. When everyone had turned in their exams, Professor Hayes stood up and faced the class. The stack of papers sat on his desk, about 75 exams in total. 75 different attempts to answer an unanswerable question, or maybe 74 attempts and one different approach entirely. "Thank you all for your effort today," Professor Hayes said. His voice was measured, professional. "I know this exam was unlike anything you've encountered before. That was intentional. I'll have these graded by the end of the week. Results will be posted on Friday." Students groaned at that. Friday was 4 days away. 4 days of wondering if they'd passed or failed. 4 days of not knowing what the right answer had been. 4 days of thinking about David walking out of that room with confidence while they'd all struggled. "Can you at least tell us what the answer was?" Jessica asked, her voice small but brave. Professor Hayes looked at her and almost smiled. Almost. "The answer will become clear when you see your grades," he said. Class dismissed, and that was it. No explanation, no hints, no comfort for the confused and worried students filing out of his classroom. They gathered their bags and left, clustering in groups in the hallway, immediately breaking into discussions about what had just happened. That was the weirdest test I've ever taken. I wrote like 5 pages and I still don't think I answered the question. What do you think David wrote? I don't know, but he looked way too confident for someone who just took an impossible exam. Maybe he's just cocky. No, David's not like that. He doesn't do things halfway. If he turned it in early, he must have been sure. The conversations continued as students left the building and spread across campus. By lunchtime, everyone in the advanced critical thinking class had texted or called their friends, sharing the story of the impossible one-word exam. By dinner, people in other classes had heard about it. By the next morning, it seemed like half the university was talking about Professor Hayes' crazy test, but nobody knew what David had written. He wasn't the type to brag or share information. When classmates found him later that day and asked what his answer had been, he just smiled and said, "We'll find out Friday." He wouldn't elaborate, wouldn't give hints, wouldn't even say if he felt confident about it. He just waited, calm as ever, while everyone else worried and wondered. Those 4 days until Friday felt like the longest week of the semester. Students in the class couldn't stop thinking about the exam. They'd dream about it at night, wake up with new ideas about what the answer might have been, then realize it was too late to change anything. The uncertainty was almost worse than the test itself. Some students convinced themselves they'd done okay. Maybe Professor Hayes would be lenient, grade on a curve, recognize that they'd at least tried to engage with the question. Others were certain they'd failed and started mentally preparing for the hit their GPA was about to take. A few considered dropping the class entirely, though it was probably too late in the semester for that. And through it all, David went about his normal routine. Attending classes, studying in the library, eating in the dining hall. If he was worried about his grade, he didn't show it. If he was confident he'd aced the exam, he didn't brag about it. He just waited, patient and quiet, for Friday to arrive. Friday morning arrived, and the hallway outside Professor Hayes' office was more crowded than anyone could remember seeing it. Word had spread that the exam results would be posted at 9 in the morning, right outside his door on the bulletin board where all class announcements were made. Students from the advanced critical thinking class started gathering at 8:30, too anxious to wait any longer. The energy was intense. People were nervous, excited, curious, and terrified all at once. Some students stood in small groups talking quietly about what they thought their grades might be. Others stood alone, arms crossed, staring at the empty bulletin board as if they could make the results appear through sheer willpower. A few were checking their phones constantly, refreshing their email, hoping maybe Professor Hayes would send the grades digitally instead of making them all wait here. Jessica arrived at 8:45. She'd barely slept the night before, running through her exam in her head over and over, trying to remember exactly what she'd written. She found a spot against the wall and waited, her stomach churning with anxiety. This was 40% of her grade. 40%. If she'd failed this exam, it would be almost impossible to pass the class. Brian showed up a few minutes later. He looked tired, too. He'd spent the last 4 days trying to convince himself that his essay about existentialism was actually brilliant, that Professor Hayes would appreciate the depth of thought he'd put into it. But deep down he knew he'd been reaching, filling pages just to fill them. He nodded at Jessica, and they shared a look that said everything. They were both scared. Melissa arrived at 8:50, looking more composed than most. She'd made peace with whatever was going to happen. She'd done her best, written something thoughtful, and that was all she could do. Still, her heart was beating faster than normal as she joined the crowd. Kevin shuffled in just before 9, looking like he'd already accepted his fate. He knew his half-page answer was terrible. He was just here to confirm what he already knew. And then there was David. He arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, walking calmly through the crowd. Students parted to let him through, watching him with curious eyes. Some looked at him with hope, thinking maybe if he'd figured it out, the curve would save them. Others looked at him with resentment, thinking he was probably the reason they'd all fail in comparison. But David just gave polite nods to people he recognized and found a spot near the back of the crowd. At exactly 9 o'clock, Professor Hayes' office door opened. He stepped out carrying a single sheet of paper and a roll of tape. The crowd fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop in that hallway. Everyone held their breath as he walked to the bulletin board and carefully taped up the paper. "Your grades are posted," he said simply. "I'll be in my office if anyone has questions." Then he turned and went back inside, closing the door behind him. For a moment, nobody moved. It was like everyone was too scared to look. Then someone near the front pushed forward, and suddenly everyone was trying to get closer, craning their necks to see the posted results. The paper had a list of student ID numbers, not names, for privacy. Next to each number was a grade. Students scrambled to find their numbers, hearts pounding, and then the gasp started. Oh no, I failed. This can't be right. 42? I got a 42? The numbers were brutal. Most students had scores in the 30s and 40s. A few had made it to the 50s. One or two had scored in the 60s. But those were the exceptions. The vast majority of the class had failed and failed badly. Jessica found her number, 38. She'd gotten a 38 out of 100. She'd written 4.5 pages, really tried to engage with the question, and she'd still failed spectacularly. She felt tears starting to form in her eyes. This was going to destroy her grade point average. Brian found his score, 45. Better than most, but still a clear failure. All that writing about existentialism, all those philosophers he'd referenced, all that effort, and it had barely made a difference. He'd failed just like almost everyone else. Melissa scored a 52, the highest grade he'd seen so far besides one. She'd written about curiosity and questioning. It was better than most, but still a failing grade. She'd actually thought she'd done okay, but apparently okay wasn't good enough. Kevin found his number and saw a 30. He'd expected it, but seeing it written there on the page still hurt. His half-page answer had been worth almost nothing. And then someone near the front of the crowd said, "Wait, who got 100? The murmuring stopped. Everyone looked at the sheet more carefully, and there it was at the top of the list. One student ID number with a perfect score of 100. The only passing grade on the entire sheet. The only person who'd gotten the exam right. "That's David's number," someone said. "David got 100. He's the only one who passed." Every head in the hallway turned to look at David. He stood near the back of the crowd, his face calm, showing no surprise or smugness. He'd known. Of course he'd known. That's why he'd been so relaxed all week. That's why he'd walked out of the exam early with that confident expression. "How?" Jessica said, her voice cracking. "How did you figure it out?" Other students echoed her question. The crowd pressed closer to David, everyone wanting answers. How had he done it? What had he written? What was the secret that everyone else had missed? David looked around at all the desperate, confused faces. He didn't look happy about being the only one who'd passed. If anything, he looked uncomfortable with all the attention. But he also knew everyone deserved an explanation. "I just answered honestly," he said quietly. "I didn't try to write what I thought Professor Hayes wanted to hear. I responded to what was actually on the page." "But what did you write?" Brian asked. "We all responded to what was on the page. We answered why. We just answered it differently." Before David could respond, Professor Hayes' office door opened again. He stood in the doorway looking out at the crowd of students. His expression was serious but not unkind. He'd clearly heard the commotion and knew he needed to address it. "I think," he said, his voice carrying across the hallway, "that you all deserve an explanation. Please come in, all of you." The students filed into his office, which wasn't really big enough for everyone, but they made it work. Some sat in the chairs. Others leaned against the walls or stood in the doorway. Everyone was quiet, waiting to hear what Professor Hayes had to say. He walked to his desk and picked up a single piece of paper from the stack of exams. David's exam. He held it up so everyone could see it, though from where most students stood, they couldn't make out what was written on it. "I want to start by saying that this exam was designed to be difficult," Professor Hayes began. "Not difficult in the traditional sense where you need to memorize facts or understand complex theories. Difficult in that it required you to think differently than you're used to thinking." He paused, looking around at all the anxious faces. "This is advanced critical thinking. All semester I've been teaching you to question assumptions, to look at problems from multiple angles, to recognize when the obvious answer might not be the right answer. This exam was a test of whether you'd actually learned those lessons." Jessica felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She had a sense of where this was going and she wasn't going to like it. "The question on your exam was why?" Professor Hayes continued. "Just that one word. No context, no instructions, no guidance. And almost all of you did exactly what I expected you to do. You tried to answer it. You wrote essays about philosophy, existence, meaning, purpose, curiosity. You filled pages and pages trying to provide some kind of explanation. He walked around his desk, still holding David's exam. The thing is, why? By itself isn't really a question. It's incomplete. It has no subject, no context, no clear meaning. It's like if I walked up to you on the street and just said, why? You'd probably ask, why what? Why, because the question doesn't make sense without more information. The room was completely silent. Students were starting to understand, and that understanding was painful. So what happens when you're given a meaningless question on an exam worth 40% of your grade? Professor Hayes asked. Most of you made an assumption. You assumed there must be a correct answer, so you tried to find it. You convinced yourselves that this incomplete question was actually asking something specific, and you did your best to answer what you thought it was asking. He held up David's exam again. David did something different. He recognized that the question itself was flawed, and instead of trying to answer a question that didn't make sense, he challenged it. Professor Hayes turned the exam around so everyone could see it. There, beneath the printed question, why? David had written just 2 words in clear, confident handwriting. Why not? The room erupted in reactions. Some students gasped. Others groaned. A few people actually laughed, though it was the kind of laugh you make when you realize you've been tricked. Jessica put her face in her hands. Brian stared at the paper in disbelief. Melissa actually smiled, appreciating the cleverness even though it meant she'd failed. Kevin just shook his head. Why not? Professor Hayes repeated. 2 words that completely challenged the premise of the question. If why doesn't make sense without context, then why not? Is just as valid a response as any other. Actually, it's more valid because it recognizes that the original question was incomplete. He set the exam down on his desk. This exam wasn't about philosophy. It wasn't about writing beautiful essays or referencing famous thinkers. It was about critical thinking in its purest form. It was about recognizing when a problem isn't actually a problem, or when a question isn't actually asking what it appears to be asking. Professor Hayes looked around the room at all his students. Some looked angry. Some looked devastated. Some just looked tired. But they were all listening. In the real world, he continued, you're going to encounter situations where people expect you to answer questions that don't make sense, where the assumptions built into a problem are wrong, where the obvious path forward isn't the right path, and if you just follow along, trying to give the answer you think people want, you'll miss the truth. But how were we supposed to know? Jessica asked, her voice shaky. How were we supposed to figure out that we shouldn't answer the question? Professor Hayes looked at her with something like sympathy. That's the thing about critical thinking. There's no formula. No step-by-step process that always works. You have to be willing to question everything, including the questions themselves. You have to be comfortable with uncertainty. You have to trust your own judgment even when everyone around you is going in a different direction. The silence in Professor Hayes' office was heavy after his explanation. Students stood there processing what they just learned, and you could see different emotions playing out on different faces. Some students were angry, feeling like they'd been set up to fail with a trick question. Others were disappointed in themselves for not seeing what David had seen. A few were starting to understand why this lesson, painful as it was, might actually matter. Brian was the first to speak up. So basically, we all failed because we tried too hard? There was frustration in his voice. I spent an hour writing about existentialism. I referenced real philosophers. I made actual arguments. And that's worth less than 2 words? Professor Hayes nodded, not defensively, but with understanding. Your essay was probably well written. Many of the essays I read were thoughtful and demonstrated real knowledge. But knowledge wasn't what I was testing. I was testing whether you could recognize when you're being asked to solve the wrong problem. But that's not fair, Melissa said. She wasn't angry like Brian, just confused. In every other class, every other exam we've ever taken, the point is to answer the question. We've been trained our whole lives to see a question and provide an answer. And now you're saying that training was wrong? Not wrong, Professor Hayes replied. Just incomplete. Yes, usually you should answer the questions you're asked. But sometimes the most important skill is recognizing when a question is based on faulty assumptions. When following the expected path will lead you nowhere. He walked back to his desk and leaned against it, arms crossed. He looked tired too, like giving this exam had taken something out of him as well. Think about it this way. In your future careers, whatever they might be, You're going to encounter situations where everyone expects you to do things a certain way, to follow the established process, to answer the questions your boss asks or solve the problems your company faces. But what if the question itself is wrong? What if everyone is working on the wrong problem? Kevin, who'd been quiet this whole time, finally spoke. Like if a company is trying to improve a product that nobody wants in the first place. Exactly, Professor Hayes said, pointing at him. Or if a team is trying to solve symptoms instead of addressing the root cause. Or if an entire industry is operating on assumptions that aren't true anymore. The person who succeeds isn't always the one with the best answers. Sometimes it's the one brave enough to ask different questions. Jessica wiped at her eyes. She'd stopped crying, but she still felt awful. I understand what you're saying. I do, but 40% of our grade? That's going to destroy my GPA. I've worked so hard in this class, and now one exam that I couldn't possibly have known how to approach is going to ruin everything. Professor Hayes's expression softened. I know this is difficult. I know it feels unfair, but let me ask you this. What's more important? Your grade in one class or learning a lesson that could change how you approach problems for the rest of your life? My grade, Jessica said immediately, then caught herself. I mean, obviously the lesson matters, but grades matter too. They affect graduate school applications, job opportunities, everything. You're right, Professor Hayes admitted. Grades do matter, which is why I'm going to make you all an offer. He stood up straighter, addressing the whole room. This exam counts for 40% of your grade, as I said. Most of you failed it badly, but you still have 60% of your grade to work with. The remaining assignments, participation, your final project. If you take what you learned today and actually apply it to the rest of the semester, you can still pass this class. Many of you can still do well. He paused, letting that sink in. More importantly, I'm going to give you an opportunity for extra credit. Over the next 2 weeks, I want each of you to write a reflection paper. Not about philosophy. Not about any reading we've done. I want you to write about a time when you followed assumptions without questioning them. A time when you tried to answer the wrong question or solve the wrong problem, or went down a path just because everyone else was going that way. Brian raised his hand. How much extra credit?